and the young alike. They have long endured the misery of water shortages and power cuts, but now war has come to them too, as the battle for Basra rages all around.
The main problem now is getting the civilians to push back, so when the explosions go off, we don't get like any civilian casualties, which would be catastrophic. You know what I mean?
Then, during a lull in the fighting, people can carry on with their journey out of Basra. But British troops filter out the men, trying to make sure they're not Saddam's fighters. Some fear they're going to get separated from their families. There's chaos, there's panic, but then there's joy as they're reunited with their loved ones. The British are still trying to assert their authority, not only in Basra, but also in nearby towns and villages. Well, we're now standing just outside the town of Nasiriyah, one of the places around Basra that the British hoped would fall into their hands very early on. Well, it hasn't happened yet, and fighters loyal to Saddam Hussein and his Ba'ath Party are still holding out just down the road from here. They're proving extremely difficult to dislodge. A British tank rolls towards one of its targets. This footage captured by a BBC camera strapped to the tank's turret. The mission here to destroy Iraqi radio and TV masts. The aim to stop Saddam Hussein pumping out propaganda to his people in the south. It is brought down, but the flashes close by are Iraqis resisting with rocket-propelled grenades. British Army bulldozers, meanwhile, attempt to eradicate all traces of Saddam in southern Iraq. The idea to convince people here that his time is over and that theirs has come. Ben Brown, BBC News, near Basra in southern Iraq.
America's 3rd Infantry Division moving north across Iraq's desert at dawn this morning. It's the first advance for these troops for 5 days, but the new push north comes amid fears that Iraqi resistance has been tougher than expected and the US-led battle plan may need adjusting. Marines were firing at Iraqi mortar positions, defending territory against an enemy that melts away all too easily.
It's pretty frustrating because it came down that we were going to be moving pretty quick, and all of a sudden now we're stopped. So we're pretty much guessing what's going on, thinking, is everything fine, everything going okay?
And even further south, in the supposedly safer world of Kuwait, this was the aftermath of an attack earlier today outside a US military base. A pickup truck rammed into a group of US soldiers, injuring several of them. Just one day after a suicide bomb attacker driving a taxi detonated a car bomb in central Iraq, killing 4 Americans. It all adds to pressure on America's defense.
And the jet targeting Iraqi troops south of Baghdad. The Harriers are flying over 10% of all coalition sorties, with the bombers averaging 50 missions a day.
With Iraqi soldiers south of Basra. They say they've captured an Iraqi general during clashes along with 4 other senior Iraqi army officers. And there's been some of the heaviest fighting so far going on around Nasiriyah. Our correspondent James Mates is there and witnessed an intense attack by the American forces firsthand.
Early evening in Nasiriyah, and the relative calm of the day is about to end. A single 1,000-pound laser-guided bomb delivered from a jet high above signals the start of a sustained, ferocious attack. 2 US Marine Cobra helicopters circle the town, preparing to take on Iraqi positions on the far bank of the Euphrates River. Their weaponry, Hellfire missiles. The results on the ground were devastating. For a week now, elements of the Iraqi military and Saddam Fedayeen guerrillas have kept the Americans at bay from these positions. Now the gloves are coming off. The US military believe the civilian population has moved into the city away from these riverside positions. It is certainly true that since the air attacks have been stepped up, resistance from Nasiriyah has lessened significantly. Less than a mile from this battle, on the American-controlled south bank of the Euphrates, the first efforts are being made to distribute humanitarian aid. This food from an Iraqi storeroom that will be given to villages nearby. Overseeing it, the Marine General commanding this sector of the front. He told me that at some stage in this battle he'd always known he'd been going to have a fight on his hands.
I don't think anyone came into here thinking it was going to be a cakewalk. We knew that there were cells like the Republican Guard. We just didn't know when we'd run into them. And maybe in this case we ran into them sooner than later.
Any sense in which you're being bogged down here?
I don't think we are bogged down. If you look at how far the forward forces have advanced, if people expect you're going to win an entire war in 7 days, maybe they have some false expectations.
You're reluctant, for obvious reasons, to get into a house-to-house, street-by-street battle, and yet up in Baghdad, that's what they're going to have to do. How does this augur for the Battle of Baghdad?
Well, I don't know the plans for the Battle of Baghdad. And it was never our intent to go into the city here. Our intent was to open the bridges and get a road north to ensure that the forces moving towards Baghdad had supplies. We've done that. I think, believe me, before we go into Baghdad, there'll be enough shaping and things conducted that we will try to mitigate every risk to our forces that we can before we have to go in there.
That battle for Baghdad may now just be a matter of days away. Two huge armies will soon be in position to the east and the west of the city. The crucial decision now for Pentagon planners, given the level of resistance they've faced so far, is are those armies strong enough, or must they wait longer for further reinforcement? Vincent is in southern Iraq and flew with the parachute regiment on their latest mission. This is his report.
The ground beneath is a land in limbo. War has turned it into a fractured, unstable place. It's the job of these British paratroopers to impose some kind of security and protect the coalition supply lines which run along these roads. Helicopters are used to perform impromptu checkpoints. The paratroopers are looking for members of the Fedayeen, the militia responsible for much of the resistance in Basra and Nasiriyah. Gestures and eye contact replace the spoken word here. Even when there's nothing to hide, it's tense.
The main threat is from these insurgent-type elements that you've heard of, the Fedayeen. They're moving around in civilian-type vehicles, dressed as civilians, so it's challenging to actually see who they are and to identify who they are. So what I'm really doing is using helicopters to do as much interdiction as I possibly can do, and then I have foot patrols on the ground to cover the gaps the helicopters aren't covering.
These flying checkpoints have the advantage of surprise. Their unexpected arrival also helps protect the soldiers from the potential threat of suicide bombers.
The Americans may be moving ever closer to Baghdad, but they've left behind them whole swathes of Iraqi territory which remain violently insecure, dappled with pockets of resistance. It's that problem which British troops are trying to deal with. It's a delicate and dangerous operation which involves a mixture of war fighting and peace enforcement.
These are the first steps in building a relationship with people in an area where 12 years ago there were revolts against Saddam's regime. But given the nature of the threat here, knowing when to raise or lower the rifle is a difficult job. Geraint Vincent, ITV News, Southern Iraq.
By late evening, Wing Commander Chris Norton already has his mission planned. Each night he prepares to fly into the war. There's no time to doubt what lies ahead.
This is the ultimate test of that teamwork. We have many, many tests, but it is the ultimate test because it's the ultimate sanction with the ultimate stakes.
He will be heading close to Baghdad. Through night vision goggles, his view will be a clear one. There's no moonlight, but easy to spot under each aircraft the bombs the Harriers take with them. Essential to their plans, this RAF tanker. Refuelling will give them more time over Iraq. Beneath them now, the Allies' front line south of Baghdad. This is US artillery being launched at Saddam Hussein's Republican Guard. And further ahead, the outskirts of the Iraqi capital. The blinking lights are anti-aircraft systems. The pilots are now in the line of fire.
There's no taking away from the fact that when you look out at all that surface-to-air, all those surface-to-air missiles and all that AAA, then it concentrates the mind. You know you're going into a hornet's nest, and it's an uncomfortable feeling.
From the air, the war looks like this. The explosions are bombs and missiles hitting the ground. But none from the Harriers, who this time watched from a distance.
It does take your breath away, yeah. I mean, there is a phenomenal amount of firepower out there, and there's a phenomenal amount of firepower being shot back.
This was just one mission and just one pilot's view of it, but here many more have seen the same thing. An air campaign like no other, and one that shows no signs of stopping. Alistair Jackson, ITV News in Kuwait.
Just a few days ago, the town of Qasr was a battleground. Now the war has moved on, leaving a desperate and angry population in its wake. The people here beg every passing car for water, but efforts are now being made to help them to help themselves.
Next, please.
These men are being hired to work at the town's port. Recruited by the British Army, they'll receive a decent wage by local standards, just over 60 pence per day. Over the last few days, the military have been going into the town of Qasr to recruit. Each time, they've been mobbed. These people are the lucky ones. They've been selected for jobs. The first and most important task here, building a bond of trust.
I'm trying to reassure them about that, we're here to stay until the job is complete. To make sure that they realise that, the regime that they've had will end in the future.
But that may take time. These youngsters told me they still fear the coalition troops will leave and Saddam's forces will come back. The army and the people here know a job is just the first step on the road to a new Iraq. Martin Geisler, ITV News, Qasr.
Apply Squadron. Kerry, what sort of aid are we talking about specifically?
Well, the main commodity that we're dealing with is the Humanitarian ration pack, which is enough food for one man for one day. In the main, it provides a number of ingredients, the basic foods like rice and beans, as well as some snacks, cracker bread, providing the essential carbohydrates and protein that the people need.
But isn't the problem at the moment getting this aid into areas where there's fighting?
We've already pushed a considerable amount of this aid up country. The problem at the moment that we have is identifying areas and people who desperately need this aid. And in those areas which aren't yet secure, that is obviously difficult.
And what about the convoys you're pushing across the border now? I mean, they're soft-skinned vehicles. How vulnerable are they?
The soft-skinned vehicle will always be more vulnerable than the armoured one. Obviously, the people that are driving these vehicles are trained soldiers and they are armed. We've taken the additional security procedure of taking an armed convoy of escort to escort these goods forward.
And just finally, give us a sense of what goes on here. It's a huge base. What goes on here 24 hours a day?
This is the focal point for the division. We deal with all commodities that come through us and then are pushed forward to the fighting troops at the front line.
OK, thanks very much.
Is to be less chaotic than the enemy. Nothing illustrates that chaos more than blue-on-blue incidents when servicemen are killed by friendly fire. 12 years ago in the Gulf, 25% of American casualties were friendly fire. So far this time, 4 British servicemen have been killed by friendly fire, the latest near Basra, when 2 members of a tank crew died when a Challenger mistakenly opened fire on another. Deciding to shoot a tank's gun is a split-second decision made in the severest circumstances.
They're working in a very restricted environment. They're cramped inside a tank. They've got one radio set playing in one ear, one radio set playing in another ear. At the same time, it's obviously hot in there, which is extremely draining. They're looking through either a thermal sight or through an optical sight, and they're asked to make split decisions. They've got an enemy which is coming in from any direction at any time and in any form.
You see a tank. Is it friend or foe? Your sights magnify the potential target 4 times. Your initial guide is the naked eye. You have only 4 seconds to decide friend or foe before he fires at you. There is technology to guide your decision, generally speaking more of it in American tanks than in the Challenger. There's a thermal imager for night vision. American tanks have 2. There's radio communication, but they're notoriously unreliable. And there's no computerized map showing enemy and friendly positions, like the Americans have.
You can't design a system. I think it's beyond technology to design a system that will run the battlefield remotely without the need for humans. And so whilst there are humans in the loop, there's always room for error.
In the fog of war, telling friend from foe is the oldest problem facing soldiers. And despite the technology, it will always be so, as long as conflict continues. Maurice McGinty, ITV News.
Really, if we were still fighting this fight in May or June or July or August, then the weather would be a tremendous concern. Right now, it's really not, and they hope that this battle is over in a matter of weeks rather than a matter of months, although they're prepared for whatever contingency arises. As I said before, they're more concerned, for example, right now about the possibility that they might come under artillery strikes, chemical strikes, that they've got. One thing that they've been somewhat surprised at is the rocket-propelled grenades, the RPGs, the Iraqis are using in great volume, with little effect, we should add, thus far, but they're using it to a great degree, and they've been concerned about that as well. We've stopped right now. You can see some of these Bradleys and some of the tanks on the horizon here, just sort of spread out across the desert here. They don't like to, when they stop, be in one line because it would make them more vulnerable to a potential strike. They like to spread out so that if there was incoming mortar or incoming artillery, that the odds of it doing great damage to the force would be much less.
There's more evidence today that the bombing campaign over Iraq is increasing. Our correspondent John Draper is on board an American aircraft carrier in the eastern Mediterranean, precisely where we're not allowed to say. But what is clear is that the number of missions flown by American pilots has grown over the last few days. Here's his report.
On the USS Truman, they're stepping up the bombing missions. Round the clock, they load up with some of the most destructive ordnance on the planet. An hour and a half later, they drop it on Baghdad. This carrier is named after President Harry S. Truman. They've adopted his slogan, "Give 'em hell." Hell is exactly what these F-14 and F-18 bombers are unleashing over targets in Iraq. I spoke to two pilots who'd just come back from targeting Kirkuk and Mosul about the difference between training flights and the real thing.
You have the potential of people firing back up at you and SAM threats. It's a little different, but that's the real difference, is that you have to put on your game face when you're ready to put ordnance on and take someone's life, which is you don't take lightly.
After days and days of bombing missions over northern Iraq, often around the clock, the USS Harry S. Truman is now being restocked with more bombs, more munitions. Since the war started, this ship and its sister ship, the Roosevelt, has flown more than 300 sorties over northern Iraq, where the message from the Pentagon is, step it up. The top brass came on board to ram home that message. Vice Admiral Scott A. Fry rallied the troops and told them to drop more bombs.
You people you're not even walking fast on Harry S. Truman. There's a lot more strike power we could get out of these two aircraft carriers. And as soon as I get more gas in the air, we're going to do just that.
Getting more gas in the air is a reference to mid-air refueling of bombers over Iraq and the refusal of Turkey to allow US bases there to send up their tankers. When the planes aren't being flown, they're being serviced and checked and sent up from the hangar below the flight deck. Twice a day, the crew walk the deck, looking for pieces of debris that could be sucked up into a jet engine. There are brief periods off to visit the barber, phone the folks back home, or use the ship's own supermarket. In one of the many restaurants, I caught up with an English-born helicopter crew member. Les Hatfield was brought up in Kidderminster. His dad was American, now he is.
And my heart's kind of split in two places, you know, being raised in England and obviously spending the last 20 years over here in the US.
What do you think of the joint coalition effort?
I think it's great. I think it's something we need to do, and I'm just glad that the British and Americans are just getting on so good, just doing it.
Oddly, for people waging a war, many are getting their news of it from television. Like those at home, their spirits rise with the successes, fall on news of losses. But nothing gets in the way of the ship's objective, relentless, unabating bombing missions over Iraq. In a few hours' time, these bombs will have been dropped. They'll no longer exist. Neither will any Iraqi troops they may fall on. John Draper, ITV News, on the USS Harry S.
At the bus station on the outskirts of Amman, Zuhair and his friends are getting ready to head to Baghdad. $8 buys a bus ride to the border, back to the country they left years ago. They are going, they say, to fight. The war started and we have no choice, says Zuhair. No one is forcing us, but we have to go. Every day since the war began, hundreds of mostly young Iraqi men have shown up here, ready to brave that perilous drive. Nearly 6,000 have crossed so far. It is a question, they say, of their homeland. Down at the Iraqi embassy, the staff are busy issuing thousands of new identity documents to Iraqis who thought they would not return again during the time of Saddam Hussein. Embassy staff handed out posters. But many of those who came here say they're returning to fight for Iraq, not Saddam Hussein. It is my home, he says. I'm going home to defend my country. The U.S. calls this Operation Iraqi Freedom, a war of liberation, they say, to make Iraq's people free. Commanders acknowledge the resistance has been unexpectedly fierce. One reason, perhaps, is history. A history not of liberation, but occupation. The Turks and their Ottoman Empire, the British, who believed they were bringing order and law and who paid a terrible price in Iraq when the people rose up. And there are these images, daily reminders of the ongoing occupation by Israel of Palestinian territory.
No country, no people in this world like to see military occupation on their land.
Bassam Awadallah is a Jordanian minister trying to explain why the Arab view, the Iraqi view, doesn't necessarily see liberation, but something else.
The war has been shifted in a way that it is no longer a war being fought against the Iraqi regime. It is a war that is being fought against the Iraqi homeland.
And they are fighting, they say, to defend their homes. It is not just Iraq's regime at war, but Iraq's people. Khalid, an Iraqi physiotherapist, is making plans to leave his family in Amman and return to Baghdad. America, he says, does not have right on its side. America does not have the right to occupy my country. And if America stays, says Khalid and many others, no matter how little the time, what they are thinking about is occupation and resistance.
Embassy in Baghdad. This appears to be over the wall at the back of the Iranian embassy. I'm just behind the 28th of April shopping center. You can see quite clearly there the name of the shopping center right on the 28th of April street. That's President Saddam Hussein's birthday. That's why the street has that name. And I think we're pulling out there. You get a better idea of the of that building that's above the shopping center. It has a bank in it. Just to the right-hand side of that particular building is where the Ministry of Information is. And the whole area behind the fire, an area of housing for government officials, for senior Ba'ath Party officials, for retired members of the military. Quite an exclusive housing area there, John.
Transferred from one group of American soldiers to another. At least 27 of them surrendering to a long-range artillery unit near the city of Najaf in central Iraq, telling soldiers from the 101st Airborne that they'd been forced to fight for Saddam Fedayeen, a paramilitary group loyal to President Saddam Hussein.
Fedayeen are trying to compel forcefully local civilians to fight for the Iraqis. Kind of what we suspected. These guys flew for their life other than fight U.S. forces.
A U.S. soldier uses a cheat sheet with Arabic phrases like, "be quiet." It is a strange mix of comfort and authority.
Part of just a security both for themselves and for us. So it's important to know that although it may look bad, they're being treated very, very well, actually. Each have their own bottles of water.
A small but important gesture. The Army's thinking is that the better the prisoners are treated, the better the chances that other Iraqis, having heard how these prisoners were treated, will also want to surrender. But for now, security is paramount and time is short. The Iraqis have since been transferred again, this time to the rear, where they will be questioned. Ryan Chilcote, CNN, with the 101st Airborne near Najaf, Iraq.
Bombs fall on the long and rugged northern front, while targets in and around the city of Mosul continue to take a pounding.